To Kwa Wan, a bustling district located in Kowloon, Hong Kong, still retains much of the nostalgic charm of old Hong Kong. Its streets, lined with tenement buildings and vibrant markets, have been featured in numerous iconic films, such as A Better Tomorrow, Chungking Express, and Transformers: Age of Extinction. Despite its cinematic allure, the district harbors a dark and chilling secret, one that unfolded decades ago and continues to haunt its history. The name To Kwa Wan itself has a mysterious origin. One theory suggests that the bay once resembled a watermelon, inspiring the name. Another theory posits that the area's residents primarily grew watermelons, which led to its unique moniker. Regardless of its origins, the name would later become synonymous with one of the most gruesome and unsettling cases in Hong Kong's history. It was a quiet Sunday in the apartment complex on To Kwa Wan Road. Residents, many of whom had lived there for years, began gathering in the hallways to discuss a peculiar issue that had plagued the building for weeks. For some reason, the toilets across the building seemed to be malfunctioning in strange and inexplicable ways. These problems were particularly pronounced on weekends when water usage surged. Sometimes the toilets would stop working entirely, forcing residents to queue up to use the restroom. A humiliating and frustrating ordeal. Complaints echoed through the building, and tensions were running high. On that particular Sunday, however, the situation reached a breaking point. The toilets had completely run out of water, rendering them unusable. The disruption to daily life was severe, and the residents could no longer endure the inconvenience. Determined to find a solution, the residents gathered for an impromptu meeting. After some discussion, they concluded that the problem likely stemmed from the rooftop water tank, which hadn't been cleaned in years. They suspected that sediment and debris had accumulated over time, clogging the pipes. Everyone agreed that the tank needed to be cleaned immediately. Pooling their money, the residents hired 2 repairmen to inspect and clean the tank. The workers arrived promptly and were escorted to the rooftop. They opened the water tank lid and peered inside. As expected, they found that the tank was clogged with mud and debris, which had likely disrupted the water flow. Without delay, the workers began draining the tank and cleaning its interior. At 9:15 a.m., after about 30 minutes of work, the water tank had been mostly emptied. The workers, now wearing protective gear, climbed into the tank to clear away the remaining sludge. While scraping the bottom, one of them noticed a peculiar object. It was round, wrapped in thick black grime, and felt strange to the touch. Curious, he picked it up and handed it to his partner. The moment his partner took a closer look, he screamed in horror. It was a human skull. The discovery sent shockwaves through the building. Residents, who had been anxiously waiting to hear about the progress of the repairs, were horrified when they learned what had been found. The workers immediately stopped their cleaning and called the police. Within minutes, officers from Kowloon police station arrived at the scene and secured the area. As they inspected the tank, they noticed something else unusual. Beneath the remaining sludge, there appeared to be a layer of concrete at the bottom of the tank. Fearing what might lie beneath, the police requested assistance from the fire department. With heavy equipment, firefighters began breaking through the concrete. What they uncovered was far more gruesome than anyone had anticipated. Embedded within the concrete were 3 yellow suitcases, each encased in the hardened material. The suitcases were retrieved with great difficulty and opened by investigators. Inside each suitcase were human bones, haphazardly stuffed in, as though someone had tried to conceal them in a hurry. The bones were severely decomposed, indicating that they had been submerged for years. Alongside the remains, the water tank contained other strange and chilling items, including bed sheets, a folding chair, and a bird cage. One suitcase contained a particularly crucial clue: a photograph. Although the photograph had been damaged by water, 3 Chinese characters on the back were still legible. Investigators believed the photograph belonged to the victim and would later use it to piece together the mystery of who had met such a grim fate. The Grisly Discovery plunged the building into chaos. Horrified residents huddled together, whispering theories about who the victim could be and how the remains had ended up in their water tank. Forensic experts arrived on the scene to collect evidence, and the tank was sealed off as an active crime scene. By January 15, 1985, forensic experts had reassembled the bones found in the suitcases. After careful examination, they determined that the victim was a man aged between 25 and 40 years old, standing approximately 1.65 meters tall. The body had been submerged for approximately 5 years, making it impossible to determine the exact cause of death. However, a sharp, clean-cut wound on the victim's right arm suggested that it had been severed with a blade. As forensic experts worked to identify the victim, police investigators began questioning the building's residents. Many had lived there for years and were well acquainted with the complex's history. Their inquiries quickly led them to an intriguing lead. 5 years ago, in 1980, a man named Deng Yingjie had mysteriously disappeared from the building. Deng had been 33 years old at the time of his disappearance and was well known to everyone in the apartment complex. The photograph found in the suitcase bore Chinese characters that matched Deng's name. Slowly but surely, investigators began piecing together the story of Deng Yingjie, a man whose dark past had finally resurfaced in the most gruesome of ways. On January 16, 1985, the police confirmed that the victim found in the water tank was indeed Deng Yingjie, the man who had gone missing 5 years earlier. Deng's family was called in to assist with the investigation, and they identified several personal belongings found in the water tank, including the damaged photograph, as items belonging to Deng. As the investigation deepened, more details about Deng's life and disappearance began to emerge. Deng Yingjie, once a prominent figure in the notorious Fire Prosperity Gang, had a reputation for being bold, aggressive, and an exceptional fighter. Nicknamed Golden Fist, he was known for his combat skills and his ability to rise quickly through the gang's ranks. However, Deng's career in the gang world came to an abrupt halt at the age of 29, when he sustained severe injuries during a brawl. These injuries left him with permanent physical limitations, including erectile dysfunction, which drastically altered his personality. Instead of quietly managing his condition, Deng bizarrely turned it into a source of arrogant pride. He boasted to anyone who would listen about his past exploits, his conquests with women, and even his dysfunction, which he described in exaggerated and crude detail. He often claimed that despite his condition, women still adored him, further alienating those around him. After retiring from gang life, Deng moved into the To Kwa Wan apartment complex, where his reputation as a menace only grew. No longer a feared gangster, he turned his attention to the tenants of the building, particularly the women. Deng was a known predator. He frequently harassed female residents, spied on them, exposed himself, and even urinated in public spaces. His behavior made him deeply despised among the tenants, but his past gang affiliations silenced any complaints. Despite the collective hatred toward him, no one dared to confront Deng directly. Many of the tenants harbored quiet resentment, hoping for a day when he might disappear. To their surprise, that day came in 1980 when Deng suddenly vanished without a trace. His father reported him missing, but the tenants, relieved by his absence, refused to cooperate with the investigation. The police, aware of Deng's criminal history, speculated that he might have fled Hong Kong to escape gang retaliation. With no leads and no evidence, the case was eventually closed, and Deng's name faded from public memory. The rediscovery of Deng's remains 5 years later reopened the case and reignited speculation about who might have wanted him dead. Given Deng's history, many initially assumed that his murder was likely the result of a gang-related dispute. However, experienced investigators quickly dismissed this theory. They pointed out that organized crime syndicates typically had specific and methodical ways of dealing with enemies. Their preferred methods often involved tying heavy objects to victims and dumping them into the sea. Methods designed to ensure complete disappearance without a trace. In contrast, the state of Deng's body suggested something different. The dismembered remains, hastily stuffed into suitcases and hidden in a water tank, indicated a lack of planning and a great deal of panic. This led investigators to believe that the crime was not carried out by professionals, but rather by someone acting impulsively, perhaps out of anger or fear. With this new theory, police turned their attention to the residents of the apartment complex. On January 20, 1985, investigators gathered information about everyone who had lived in the building over the past 5 years. The complex, though densely populated, had seen surprisingly little turnover during that time. Two former tenants, in particular, stood out during the investigation. The first was an older couple with the surname Chan, who had moved out in November 1983, citing a desire to reunite with their son overseas. However, further questioning revealed that they had no connection to Deng or the circumstances of his disappearance. The second was a young couple, identified as Wu Xutai and Liang Yufang, who had moved out shortly after Deng's disappearance in May 1980. When questioned about their reason for leaving, the couple claimed they had been allocated a new apartment through a government housing program. However, upon checking official records, investigators discovered a glaring inconsistency. The couple had not received their new apartment until 1982, 2 years after they claimed to have moved. This discrepancy raised immediate suspicions. Investigators began to dig deeper into Wu and Liang's background and quickly uncovered troubling details about their time in the building. According to neighbors, Wu, a 22-year-old chef at the time, was a mild-mannered and hard-working man who left early for work and returned late in the evening. Liang, his girlfriend and the same age as him, was a homemaker who stayed home to care for their 2-year-old son. The couple lived in a cramped 10-square-meter unit on the 7th floor. It was during this time that Deng Yingjie, with his predatory tendencies, began targeting Liang Yufang. Liang was young, beautiful, and soft-spoken, traits that immediately caught Deng's attention. He began harassing her shortly after she moved into the building. Deng would stalk her, often lurking near the communal bathrooms or peeping through the thin curtains of her tiny apartment. He even followed her to the public showers, where he would spy on her as she bathed. What made Deng's behavior particularly sinister was his enjoyment of making his victims aware of his presence. Liang soon realized that Deng was deliberately letting her see him watching, heightening her fear and helplessness. She confided in Wu, who, though normally calm and passive, became furious at Deng's actions. Wu confronted Deng on several occasions, demanding that he stop harassing Liang. However, Deng, emboldened by his past gang ties, mocked Wu and dismissed his warnings. Instead of backing down, Deng escalated his harassment. He began barging into the communal bathrooms while Liang was using them, exposing himself and making vulgar remarks. On one occasion, he openly suggested that Wu lend Liang to him for a few days, claiming it might cure his sexual dysfunction. Deng's audacity enraged Wu, but also left him feeling powerless. The couple considered moving out, but financial constraints made it impossible. They had borrowed money to pay a year's rent in advance, and breaking the lease would mean losing their savings. Trapped and desperate, they had no choice but to endure Deng's continued harassment. The situation reached a boiling point one afternoon when Liang was cooking in their small kitchen. Deng barged into their apartment uninvited, cornered her, and attempted to sexually assault her. Liang struggled and managed to escape to another room, but Deng blocked the doorway, hurling vulgar insults at her. When Wu returned home that evening and heard what had happened, he was filled with rage. For Wu, this was the last straw. He decided he could no longer stand idly by and resolved to confront Deng directly. The confrontation took place on April 5, 1980, during the Qingming Festival. Early that morning, Wu stormed into Deng's apartment and confronted him. Deng, unrepentant, mocked Wu and claimed that Liang had been the one to pursue him. Enraged, Wu shouted back, unleashing all the frustration he had bottled up over months of harassment. Deng, provoked by Wu's words, grabbed a 45cm kitchen knife and lunged at him. A violent struggle ensued. Although Deng was older and slower due to his past injuries, he was still dangerous. Wu began to lose ground. But at that critical moment, Liang entered the room with a folding chair and struck Deng on the back of the head. Deng collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Overcome with fear and anger, Wu grabbed the knife and stabbed Deng repeatedly. Blood soaked the floor as Deng Yingjie took his last breath. As Deng's lifeless body lay on the blood-soaked floor, Wu Xutai and Liang Yufang were overcome with shock and terror. The once timid Wu sat trembling, staring at the consequences of his violent outburst, while Liang, still shaken from her narrow escape, ran to the bathroom and vomited. The weight of what they had done slowly began to sink in. Deng Yingjie, who had tormented them for months, was now dead, but the thought of what would happen if they were caught paralyzed them both with fear. Wu contemplated turning himself in, but the sight of Liang's tear-streaked face and the thought of their 2-year-old son stopped him. He reasoned that Deng's death was an act of self-defense and a desperate response to unbearable harassment. But how could they explain this to the police? Convinced that no one would believe them, Wu made the difficult decision to dispose of the body. Driven by fear, the couple began cleaning the crime scene. Wu found 3 large yellow suitcases in Deng's room and decided they would serve as makeshift containers for the body. With shaking hands, he began the gruesome task of dismembering Deng's corpse. The knife struggled to cut through bone, forcing Wu to use a saw to sever Deng's stiffened right arm. Meanwhile, Liang helped clean the blood-stained floor and pack Deng's personal belongings into the suitcases, unknowingly leaving behind a critical clue: the photograph. Once the body was dismembered and stuffed into the suitcases, Wu and Liang filled them with wet concrete to weigh them down. However, disposing of the heavy suitcases presented another challenge. The streets of To Kwa Wan were busy and crowded, and transporting them unnoticed would be nearly impossible. After much deliberation, Wu devised a plan. The rooftop water tank, long neglected and rarely inspected, would serve as the perfect hiding place. In the early hours of April 6, 1980, when most residents were asleep, the couple carried the 3 heavy suitcases to the rooftop. The task was arduous and nerve-wracking, but they managed to lower the suitcases into the water tank and push them to the bottom. To ensure no one would find them, Wu poured an additional layer of concrete over the suitcases, believing that this final step would conceal their crime forever. However, their anxiety didn't end there. They realized they still had a pile of bloodied items, including a birdcage, a folding chair, and a bedsheet, left in their apartment. Panicking, Wu hastily wrapped the items in the blood-stained bedsheet and threw them into the water tank along with Deng's remains. Exhausted and terrified, the couple returned to their apartment, praying that they had erased all evidence of their crime. For a time, it seemed as though their plan had worked. Deng Yingjie's disappearance went unnoticed, and the residents of the building, relieved to be rid of him, didn't question his absence. Even when Deng's father filed a missing person report, the tenants, who despised Deng, refused to cooperate with the police. To them, Deng's absence was a blessing, and they wanted no part in bringing him back. A month later, in May 1980, Wu and Liang moved out of the apartment, citing their allocation of a new home as the reason for their departure. In reality, they couldn't bear to live under the same roof where Deng's body was hidden. They relocated to a wooden house in Ngao Chi Wan, far from To Kwa Wan, and tried to rebuild their lives. The couple married and had a daughter in 1982, finally receiving the new government apartment they had claimed to have earlier. Financially stable and with a growing family, they thought they had left the nightmare behind. But the ghost of Deng Yingjie wasn't ready to let them go. 4 years after the murder, in September 1984, the cracks in their seemingly normal life began to show. Liang Yufang, once cheerful and optimistic, started showing signs of severe mental distress. She often woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, screaming that she had seen Deng Yingjie's face. She described his eyes as wide and bloodshot, staring at her from the shadows of their bedroom. Sometimes she claimed to hear his voice whispering from the darkness, "Why did you do this to me? I'm coming back for you." At first, Wu dismissed her fears as guilt-induced nightmares, but soon he too began experiencing strange occurrences. He often felt a cold presence following him when he walked home late at night, and on several occasions, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of their living room. When he turned on the lights, there was nothing there. One night, Liang woke Wu, trembling with fear. She claimed that Deng had been standing at the foot of their bed, his body dripping wet and his lips moving, though no sound came out. When she finally understood his words, she sobbed uncontrollably. "You'll pay for what you've done. I'll take everything from you." Liang's paranoia grew more intense. She began avoiding water entirely, refusing to shower or drink from the tap. She insisted that Deng's spirit lingered in the water and would harm her if she let her guard down. Wu, desperate to calm her fears, suggested they visit the Wang Tai Sin Temple, a renowned spiritual sanctuary in Hong Kong, to seek protection. At the temple, Liang drew a fortune slip that was marked as extremely inauspicious. She turned to a fortune teller for guidance, and his words left her pale with terror. The spirit is angry. Your sins are heavy, and retribution will come. The water is cursed because of what you put there. You must confess, or the curse will follow you. Convinced that Deng's spirit was exacting revenge, Liang began praying daily at a makeshift altar in their home. Wu joined her, offering food and incense to appease Deng's ghost. One night, in desperation, Wu whispered a plea, "Come for me if you must. But leave my wife and children alone." Despite their prayers, the nightmares continued, and Liang became increasingly withdrawn, isolating herself from friends and family. By October 1984, her mental state had deteriorated so much that Wu feared for her safety. Then, tragedy struck. On a fateful day in October, Liang decided to visit another fortune teller, hoping for answers and solace. Wu, wary of her fragile state, tried to convince her to stay home, but she insisted. During her journey, the car she was traveling in inexplicably veered off the road and overturned. Liang was thrown from the vehicle and landed face down in a shallow puddle of water, no more than 5 centimeters deep. By the time help arrived, Liang had already drowned. The circumstances of her death baffled investigators. There were no visible injuries on her body, and the shallow puddle seemed insufficient to cause drowning. Yet Liang was gone. To Wu, there was no doubt. This was Deng Yingjie's doing. The irony was undeniable. Just as Deng's body had been submerged in water, Liang's life had ended in water as well. By January 1985, Wu Xutai could no longer bear the crushing weight of guilt and fear. When police discovered Deng Yingjie's remains in the water tank and began re-interviewing former residents of the building, Wu knew it was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. He decided to confess. When officers arrived at his new home in To Kwa Wan, they found Wu sitting by an altar he had built in his living room. On it were incense sticks, offerings of food, and a photograph of his late wife, Liang Yufang. Wu appeared distant, his voice barely above a whisper as he muttered, "It's karma. This is karma. I deserve it." After Liang's death, Wu's life spiraled into chaos. Consumed by guilt and fear, he began hearing whispers at night, calling his name. On one occasion, he awoke to find his reflection in the mirror staring back at him. But instead of his own face, he saw Deng's bloodied visage. The apartment grew colder, even in the sweltering heat of summer, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the halls, even when no taps were turned on. Without hesitation, Wu confessed to everything. He recounted in painstaking detail how he and Liang had been tormented by Deng's harassment, how the confrontation had escalated into violence, and how they had panicked and decided to hide Deng's body in the water tank. As Wu spoke, tears streamed down his face, and his voice trembled with a mixture of grief, remorse, and exhaustion. To verify Wu's confession, the police brought him back to the To Kwa Wan apartment complex to reenact the events of that fateful night. The visit to the rooftop water tank would later become the source of eerie and inexplicable occurrences that even hardened officers struggled to explain. When Wu was escorted to the roof, he appeared visibly distressed. As he pointed out where the suitcases had been hidden, a sudden, icy gust of wind swept across the rooftop. Despite it being a warm day, the officers present reported feeling an unnatural chill. Some even claimed that their breath became visible, as though the temperature had dropped dramatically. As part of the reenactment, a police officer played the role of Deng Yingjie to demonstrate how his body might have been transported. The officer mimicked the act of lowering a suitcase into the tank while being filmed by a police camera crew. However, when the footage was reviewed later, an unsettling discovery was made. Every time the officer portraying Deng appeared in the frame, his face was blurred and distorted, as though something or someone had interfered with the recording. Another strange incident occurred when a police photographer attempted to take pictures of the water tank. His camera malfunctioned repeatedly, refusing to focus on the tank itself. When he finally managed to capture an image, the developed photograph revealed faint outlines of 3 yellow suitcases at the bottom of the tank, even though the tank had long since been emptied. These unexplained events unnerved the investigators, many of whom admitted feeling a heavy, oppressive presence while working on the rooftop. After the reenactment, some officers avoided the area altogether, unwilling to return to the scene of the crime. In July 1985, Wu Xutai stood trial at the Hong Kong High Court, charged with the murder of Deng Yingjie. The courtroom was packed, with reporters and curious citizens eager to hear the full story of the To Kwa Wan water tank case. Wu, gaunt and solemn, did not deny his actions. Instead, he told the court everything, sparing no detail about the abuse he and Liang had endured or the fateful confrontation that had ended Deng's life. Wu's defense team argued that he had acted in self-defense, describing Deng Yingjie as a violent predator who had terrorized the couple to the point of breaking. Witnesses from the apartment complex, including many of Deng's former neighbors, testified about his abusive behavior. They painted a picture of a man who had sown fear and hatred wherever he went, with no one willing to mourn his loss. The turning point in the trial came when the prosecution played the recorded footage of the reenactment. While they had intended to use the footage as evidence against Wu, the eerie distortions in the video shocked everyone present. The blurred and ghostly images of the officer portraying Deng caused an audible gasp in the courtroom, with some jurors visibly shaken. Rumors of supernatural interference began spreading among those following the case, further complicating public opinion. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: not guilty. They concluded that Wu had acted out of self-defense and desperation, with no premeditated intent to kill Deng Yingjie. The judge acknowledged the years of torment Wu had endured, and the remorse he had shown, stating, "While this court does not condone the act of taking a life, it recognizes the extraordinary circumstances that led to this tragedy. Deng Yingjie's actions were a catalyst for his own demise." Wu was acquitted and released, but his freedom came at a cost. The water tank case of To Kwa Wan remains one of Hong Kong's most chilling mysteries, blending true crime with elements of the supernatural. It raises unsettling questions about justice, morality, and the lingering consequences of violence. For Wu Xutai, the scars of that fateful night in 1980 would never fade. Though he lived the rest of his life quietly, working tirelessly to provide for his children, the memories of Deng Yingjie and the horrors of the water tank would haunt him until his final days. And as for the rooftop water tank in To Kwa Wan, it remains a symbol of the case that shocked an entire city. A silent reminder that some sins can never truly be buried, no matter how deep the water. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling and mysterious stories. Thank you, and see you again. Peace.